So it is incredibly exciting for me to welcome Dr. AJ Alvero. Uh, Dr. Alvero is an assistant research professor with the Cornell University Center for Data Science for Enterprise and Society, with affiliations in the Department of Information Science and Sociology. His work embodies computational social science in two ways. First, he uses data-driven techniques and frameworks to address sociological questions related to education, culture, demography, language, and stratification. And second, he analyzes computers and big data as objects of inquiry in their own right. His ongoing research focuses on critical moments of evaluation, specifically in college admissions, parole, and emergency room visits. He's also active in other projects touching on textual, visual, and audio outputs of generative AI. AJ has also been a very good friend of mine since graduate school. We've been through a lot together, so it's always really nice to spend time with him. AJ, take it away.
Likewise, thank you, Clint. Thanks again for the invitation. Really excited to share some new and ongoing projects. Okay, and can everyone see this? Perfect. Okay. Yeah, so I'm just going to get started. My name is AJ Alvero. I'm coming from Cornell. The name of this talk today is Admissions Essays After ChatGPT, the New Economy of Style. And just to reiterate what Clint said, like if you have questions about, technical, methodological, et cetera, anything along those lines, please just jump in and ask. Okay, great. So I'll just get started. And I will get started with what is maybe the most infamous example of a college admissions essay. So I know you can't really read out the text on the right, but I think you might be able to figure out who this person is just based on that image. And I'm going to quickly read this entire essay. So this is an admissions essay that this person submitted to Harvard, and they were eventually accepted. So the reasons that I have for wishing to go to Harvard are several. I feel that Harvard can give me a better background and a better liberal education than any other university. I've always wanted to go there, etc. To be a Harvard man is an enviable distinction and one that I sincerely hope I shall attain. This is from 1935, and this was submitted by John F. Kennedy. So the reason why I'm starting off with this as an example is that the admissions essay, since its introduction, like close to 100 years ago at this point, has been an important vehicle for applicants to communicate key information about themselves. So I know like in our modern context, we think about things like, overcoming challenges and, different obstacles we faced in life and how that's prepared us for college. But part of it is also biographical and demographic. So, for John F. Kennedy, it's it's to communicate that, like his father, indicating his, genealogy and his like kind of like cultural repertoire and cultural capital, that like his father, he also wants to go to Harvard. And these are kinds of like, kind of like wrapping these together. Like these are some of the perspectives that I'm trying to bring to studying college admissions essays and why I'm convinced they're an important piece of data to analyze. So the first perspective that I tend to bring or tend to think about is this connection between language and identity, sociolinguistics 101. So when John F. Kennedy, when he, thinking of like word choice, semantics, pragmatics, this decision to indicate that he wants to be a Harvard man like his father is communicating much more than just like the literal words that he was choosing to include. So it's also, I think, like maybe even more obvious to everyone, regardless of, your disciplinary proclivities. These are important documents in institutional organization and decision making. So specifically college admissions. So the reason why we write college admissions essays, or the reason why universities request them, is not for fun. It's to help them make decisions on who to admit, who to waitlist, and who to eventually to reject. And, like my kind of like overarching pitch to, one to myself, and like continuing to do this work and also T-Wall is that, these college admissions essays, they teach us a lot about the humans who write them, as well as the humans who read them. So to that end, just to give you a sample of some of the work I've done or that I've been a part of. So in one paper, we found that, the things that students wrote about, so the content of their essays, and then the way that they wrote about them, so the style, their writing style, were stronger predictors of their household income and of their household income than SAT scores. So, again, this is like thinking like demographically, biographically, these strong relationships between language and identity in this moment of evaluation. So in another paper, we examined every single instance of Spanish language usage in these otherwise English language documents. And again, this is just another example of what I'm talking about, of like this very strong connection between language and identity. So in this paper, what we found is 33% of Latinx applicants use some kind of Spanish in their admissions essay, but so too did about 15% of non-Latinx applicants. So, like this idea, like, oh, Spanish language is, something that's kind of like, walled off and, only like Latinx students might be using it. We actually found that, by finding the significant proportion of students who don't identify as Latinx, it's kind of pointing to Spanish language being this more like shared sociocultural resource in this moment of evaluation. So another study looked at transfer admissions essays and found lots of distinct patterns between applicants who were applying from community college versus applicants who were applying from universities. So lateral transfer versus vertical transfer. And then finally, more on these like, high level evaluation side, we also found that, popular tools to evaluate the quality of word embeddings were more favored or more aligned with the linguistic usage of higher income applicants. Basically meaning that the ways that higher income applicants were writing and, they're kind of like, the way that they were, communicating was more in line with the ways that these large scale word embedding tasks, they're kind of like their alignment of language more so than lower income applicants. This is just to give you a snapshot, of like things that I've been involved with, but also things that kind of capture this like language and identity piece and this like evaluation decision making piece. But of course, like as we all know, and like just given the title, we live in quite a different world. The cost of producing text has gone down like exponentially. Any one of us in the course of this talk could generate maybe like hundreds of college admissions essays using like some kind of LLM platform like ChatGPT. So I think like this is a huge turning point in this like in the science of like language and identity and decision making, but also it raises these questions of like can college admissions essays still teach us a lot of, it still teaches anything about the humans who writes the admissions essays as well as the humans who read them. And for this talk, what I'm going to try and do is show through 2 papers and early pilot data is that, to some extent, the answer is yes, we can still learn about people, but obviously the dynamics have shifted. So in one paper, the kind of North Star question is, who does generative AI write like? But more importantly, can they be steered to write like people from different sociodemographic groups? The second paper, the North Star question is there evidence that college applicants are using generative AI in their essay writing? And is essay writing style treated equally across sociodemographic groups? And again, I'll get into more detail. This will all make sense. And then finally is this is like my pilot kind of like very early stages kind of question, but basically this study is trying to answer the question of how does AI disclosure change the kinds of inferences that people make about author intelligence. So going back to this idea of language and identity, it's something that you can see a lot in the ways we speak and the ways that we write, but it's also something that people tend to infer from us. The ways that we speak, the ways that we write, people make judgments and evaluations based on them. How does that change with AI entering the equation? So this paper, there's a preprint available if you want to look more in detail. I have this QR code, but you can also just look on my Google Scholar page. You can find it there. Um, oops, oh my God. So, this is there's previous work by, the members of this paper as well as some other collaborators, where we found that, when you compare the writing styles between AI and humans, AI tend to write like high income male students with some caveats. And this paper that I'm referring to, that's kind of like, came a little bit before, is also open access if you're curious. So from here, what we're trying to figure out is like, okay, like in that previous paper, we saw that AI has this tendency to write like these particular students. But what happens if you prompt the models to write like particular students? So instead of giving it, this basic, prompt, and I'll explain all this in a second. What happens when you include demographic information that come from actual college applicants? So here, our data set comes from 30,000 essays submitted to a selective private university. And we also generated about 240,000 essays using 8 different AI models, where the models were only given the same essay prompt that the humans were given. So then we generated another 240,000 essays where the prompt included this sociodemographic information, like I was alluding to. So, in the prompt, part one is, here's this writing, write this college admissions essay, here's the prompt. And then in that same prompt, write this like you are a first-gen Latino male from Salinas, California, as one example. And again, these are matched with actual applicants. So methodologically, we used a lot of different embedding approaches. So one specifically that I'm about to show you was a T5 sentence embeddings, which basically takes all of the sentences in each essay, projects them onto an embedding space, and then averages them out, or then projects them on an embedding space. Then we used PCA to reduce the dimensionality. And you'll see that in 1 second. That's literally the next slide. And then separately, we also use cosine similarity to see how similar, how different essays tended to be. So in this first analysis that I'm sharing right here, so the blue dots represent the T5 embedding PCA projections of the human essays. And as you can see, the blue dot is, they're fairly, it's like one big lump. And then the AI generated essays, which are represented by the orange and green dots, there's this clear like division. So what, practically speaking, what this means is that for essays that were generated using GPT-4o, there's this clear differentiation between the human and the AI writing, such that AI, arguably doesn't quite write like anyone. And I know it's hard to see like the orange, but the orange is underneath the green, meaning that adding this like ID prompting of this sociodemographic information actually didn't change the essays that the models produced all that much. So that was, GPT-4o. So you might be thinking like, well, maybe if you tried a different model, you'll get different results. But, so we tried it again with a 4o mini. As you can see, it's the same kind of story where, the human essays are over here, the AI generated essays are over there. And you might be thinking like, well, maybe that's just a GPT thing. And it's like, well, actually, like it really did not matter. No matter no matter which model we use, no matter, this kind of like demographic information, it just didn't matter. There was always this clear difference between the AI and human generated text, and demographic prompting did not steer the models, in any kind of like significant way. In fact, like these differences were so stark, we had a classification model where we took all of the principal components as predictors, and the task was to see how well using those PCA components that a classifier could predict AI versus human text. And we got something like 99.9999% accuracy. And like what, some of my co-authors kept saying like, no, there's no way Like it can be that high, keep rerunning it, and we kept getting the same results. So just to give you another perspective, so here we're comparing the essays with cosine similarity. So, on average, the cosine similarity for human versus LLM text is fairly high. I mean, this is like a fairly circumscribed genre. It's fairly well known. There are many examples for these models to train on the internet. Um, so, the average cosine similarity is somewhere between 88 and 80, 0.88 and 0.85. But this actually did, like, when you compare the LLM essays, these are the ones without the demographic prompting, and then you compare the cosine similarity with the demographic prompting, kind of like in the previous figure, you can see there's not a significant difference. Adding this demographic information really didn't move the needle all that much. And in fact, like the essays, the LLM essays without the demographic prompting and with the demographic prompting had a much higher cosine similarity on average than either of the human conditions. So here, what this is telling us is like not only does adding this demographic prompting does not quite steer the model in ways that we might assume, but it actually ends up producing text that's more similar to other AI generated text. So here's from one other perspective. So here we wanted to see like, well, maybe it's the case when you break these cosine similarities down by different characteristics of the applicants, maybe you'll start to see different patterns. So here, we can see the green dots representing the LLM without demographic prompting, LLM with demographic prompting. Those had the highest cosine similarities. And the human to human actually had the second highest, meaning that humans within these categories write more like each other than either of the LLM generated essays. So just to walk you through the top one, LLM essays write more like each other. Male applicants write more like each other, and male applicants write the least like LLM generated text, even when you prompt it to write like a male. And this pattern, we saw it again with continuing generation versus first generation, and we saw it again with race. And collectively, these two cosine similarity results kind of point to this this phenomenon where we would hope that steering the model, which is methodologically is a very popular kind of common like technique. You would hope that it could like steer the outputs to actually sound more like actual people, and it just wasn't the case. And we tried this so many different ways with so many different models, and we just could not get any kind of different result. So just to kind of wrap this paper up, who does generative AI write like? When you zoom out a bit in this, like taking this more like embedding approach, the answer becomes nobody. We had, as I mentioned earlier, we had a 99% accuracy in classifying human versus AI essays. And then just demographic steering had no discernible effect on these, still descriptive trends. So then, to us, this led to this obvious question of like, well, okay, this is like, almost it's like lab setting kind of thing. Like, what about actual applicants in their actual applications? Are they even using AI? How might that look? And that's where the second paper comes in. So we have a preprint that was recently posted. This is the same team, but we added a colleague from CMU, Conrad Borchers. Again, take a look if you're curious. So here, what we wanted to see is if some students are students actually using AI in their admissions essays, and how does that change evaluation, if at all? So we had 80,000 applicants and essays from before and after the release of ChatGPT. We also had different demographic information. So we had SES markers, which we basically split by applicants who received a fee waiver versus those who didn't. We also have the final decisions made by the admissions office. We had other sociodemographic features, but in this talk, I'm not going to go too in depth on them. But but if you want to read more, the text is there. So so to determine the proportion of AI generated text, which is what you need to do if you're trying to figure out this question, we had an essay level estimate. I couldn't figure out how to get like the hat on the alpha in Google Slides. So like, apologies. So here what we were doing is we were comparing token likelihoods to human versus LLM reference texts. So I want to be really clear here. What we are not saying is like we have definitively identified the essays, the sentences, the words, that are definitively, qualitatively AI, like AI sourced. What we are saying is that, you know, this metric is reasonable, a reasonable approximation of AI writing style. So like this is kind of like a tricky conversation, and a tricky way of like, kind of like getting at this issue because the detectors tend to not be so great. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. Like, we're not like, we weren't trying to be like police officers and like labeling people, but rather like, whose writing is most like an LLM. Okay. And like that is a scale that goes from 0 to 1, where 0 is the most human-like and 1 is the most LLM-like. Okay. So here we compare a suite of lower level text features. I just wanted to share these, like, just to get a sense of like, for this study, we aren't looking at even like style or what they're writing about. This is much more like low level. These are the lexical patterns in such a way that's kind of like aligned with what I was just saying about like LLM usage and style and all that. And I hope that also makes sense. Okay, so there's a lot of figures here. And what I just wanted to note a few things. One is that, between higher SES, so these are the students who did not receive a fee waiver, versus the lower SES students, you can see that there's this gap between them. And like I'm guessing like this gap is somewhat emblematic of all the demographic patterns and trends that I've studied or I've seen in other work, where these gaps can like they kind of like accumulate and they lead to high income students, low income students making predictable choices and differences in their admissions essays. So this is, as you can see, these are the patterns before the release of ChatGPT. So ChatGPT came out in November 2022, meaning that essays written and submitted in November 2023, predict or possibly could have used ChatGPT or some LLM tool. So for average word length, you can see that from 2023 to 2024, the gap shrinks quite a bit. For these, lexical diversity metrics, you can also see that the gap shrinks quite a bit. And in fact, like no matter how we slice and dice the data, the trends were towards convergence for most of these metrics. So in the case of average word length, TTR, complexity, I mean they're like getting very close to each other. And then for these other features, the trend is like almost identical. Like the slope for MTLD and Yule's K are like very, very similar. So generally what this is saying is that whereas before, these differences were somewhat like notable between students from different SES backgrounds, now in this post, this ChatGPT world, they're tending towards convergence. And I saw there's 3 comments in the chat. Let me just quickly, I see. Okay, great. Yeah. So that was for that. Okay. So now like moving, this is like a different perspective. The, red line here represents admit and wait list, and green represents rejected. I think we should change the colors on that. Like this is the first time I'm realizing that, you know, I don't know, green, I don't know. I always think green means go, but whatever, that's okay. You can see here that it's a similar story. There's this clear division between, accepted versus rejected applicants. Um, and then again, with average word length, there's convergence. With TTR, it's the same kind of slope directional shifts. And, again, like in some cases, there's convergence. In other cases, like they're moving in the same direction. And, um, so not only is it the case that these trends are very notable and detectable by SES, but also by these like final decisions, meaning that whereas before the college admissions essay was this kind of like was this well-known or this easy way to like help differentiate yourself. Now it seems like it's becoming something that again there's like this convergence where it's harder to like separate yourself on average. So now this is looking at again estimated LLM usage. This is that alpha hat that I mentioned earlier. And again, you can see before 2023, there was somewhat of a gap, but it's not like super, there's somewhat of a gap. But then after 2023, you can see that lower SES applicants, you know, they they catch up to the higher SES applicants and then eventually even surpass them. Simply put, like this means that on average, they're using LLMs more than their higher SES counterparts. Although higher SES applicants seem to be using LLMs much more as well. I also want to note, like, obviously, like LLM usage was not really possible in 2020. So again, just like reiterating that this is more of like a stylistic measure. But it's kind of interestingly, it's also the case, and here like the colors are more aligned. Like red means stop, rejected. So for the red line, it seems that applicants who use LLMs more, they tend to have a lower wait a minute. Yes, so the rejected applicants tend to use LLMs more than accepted applicants. And interestingly, this also flipped the trend. Whereas accepted applicants, the gap isn't too big, and you can see that the confidence intervals are quite large. Rejected applicants tended to use this kind of language less. But now that the barrier to entry to this kind of like, highly technical, highly formal, this different register of language is so widely diffuse and available, it seems that they might be using it more and possibly to their detriment. Okay, so just to wrap this up, and again, the full paper is available. Is there evidence that college applicants are using generative AI in their essay writing? So there has been an increase in generative AI writing style, but lower SES applicants seem to be using it more, as do applicants who were eventually rejected by the university. And the next step we're going to start looking at is like, what is this intersection? Is it the case that, it's not just lower SES applicants, but also, lower SES applicants who maybe otherwise would have been competitive in another year? So we're just, we're looking more into that. And importantly, AI writings associated with decreased odds and admissions. And in general, essay features are starting to converge among all applicants. So, we can, this is taking one step back. We can think about all these moments of applicants creating these essays. We can think of all the moments of admissions officers reading these essays. But in this other paper, what I'm trying to figure out is what are the ways that AI is changing the connections that people make between text and authors from the reader's perspective. So this is an ongoing project. It's still pretty early. So like any suggestions, like big ideas, anything, I'd be very happy to hear it. Or if you want to send me an email. This is with a graduate student at Stanford who is like wonderful. Um, so here, like I've mentioned, the goal of this study is to probe the relationship between language and assumptions about intelligence as measured through readability. So for example, this phenomenon where people might say, oh, this person speaks at a third grade level as a way to kind of describe or connote their intelligence or their competence. I know it sounds like a small issue, but readability scoring and language complexity, it's kind of like one of those balls of yarn where you keep pulling and it keeps just like unraveling and unraveling and unraveling. It's like it's been surprising working on this paper. So here, just to be transparent, we are using admissions essays in this context more as like a convenient source of data that I'm familiar with, rather than, so these were, we're using 51 essays that were published in the New York Times. They used to have yearly contests for admissions essays. And in the first part of the study, what we do is we audit AI models to see if they associate higher readability scored text as more intelligent. In the second part of the study, we do an experiment where the goal is to see if people still make this association between longer, more verbose, writing and sentences and word choice. They still make that association when they know that the text is rewritten using AI. We also test whether people on average have this ideology of like longer, more complex word choice, more complex, like longer sentences, if they believe that it is also associated with intelligence. So this is one example of, this is the audit study, this first part of the study. So this blue curve that you see kind of like, you can see it most clearly on the left, that's the readability of the original 51 essays. So then in what the orange curve, what that represents is the readability scores of revised essays using GPT-4o Mini. So literally just like, here's this essay, here's this college admissions essay, revise it. And then the green and the red curves, what they represent are the readability scores of essays where we included a request in the prompt that the revisions make the author sound more intelligent. So basically, and the x-axis here is the Flesch-Kincaid grade level readability score. So basically, the original essays were at about 8th, 9th grade level. But then when you tell the model to make them sound more intelligent, they don't change much of the actual content or the story, but they do like increase the length of the sentences and increase the average word length such that the average readability goes up to about a 11th to 12th grade level. So we saw the same for Claude Haiku. We saw the same for Mistral Nemo. We saw the same for all kinds of different models, where clearly this kind of like idea of like long sentences, big words, there's like an inherent association with that and intelligence in these popular LLMs. So that's the audit. And then what we did for the experiment is we used the revised essays as stimuli for an experiment. So just to give you a sense of what that looked like, so we had participants receive one of two conditions. One condition, they were told that they had to read two versions of the same college admissions essay. It's just one was revised by the student using artificial intelligence. And the conditions for the AI revised essays were these like baseline revisions where we don't tell it to make the author sound more intelligent, or essays where the model was instructed to make the author sound more intelligent. And then we're comparing that with the original essay. And we give them just a set of questions, fairly straightforward. How would you assess the quality of this essay? How would you assess the intelligence of the author? we also added a question of what would you predict their SAT score to be just based on the essay. So, this ideology thing that I mentioned earlier, if you're familiar with the language ideologies kind of literature, this is what we were drawing on. So here we came up with this set of questions about, again, this idea of like big words, big sentences, big brains. And we use that to see if any patterns we identified in the pilot, if they were associated somehow with this particular ideology. So basically collectively what this gets at is, do people rate author intelligence as being higher at all with respect to readability? Do they rate author intelligence as going up when the readability goes up slightly? That's then that baseline condition. And do they rate author intelligence being higher when the readability goes up a lot, which is the intelligence condition? And then again, like how do these language ideologies moderate these dynamics or not? So just to give you a quick snapshot, and again, there were other things I could talk about, but this is all like pilots, like very small n. So this was the generic condition. This is when the participants were asked to evaluate the two essays, and they were not told that the student used AI to revise their writing. So here what we can see is that, generally, using this language intelligence belief scale, which is this thing right here, we created this, like a composite metric. As that attitude goes up, the average intelligence of the revised essay goes up. And that's, this is combined for the baseline where there's a slight increase in readability and the intelligence prompting. And basically what this figure is showing is that, what matters possibly more than the essay itself is their previous beliefs about language and intelligence. So interestingly, in the AI disclosure condition, and these, like, again, it's a pilot, but this is all like, statistically significant and, et cetera. What we find is that the slope does shift, but not the actual relationship. So, there is this penalty for, this language intelligence penalty for using AI, but in general, their ideologies about language and intelligence moderate that, so it's still this like positive upward slope. So in short, responses to AI disclosure are mediated by what they believe about this language intelligence connection as, measured through readability. So we also wanted to see, like, in the sociological literature, a lot of these results would have been predicted to be associated with different, demographic features of the participants. So what we found is that, again, and again, it's pilot, small, but what we found is that, generally, there weren't changes in the beliefs by education level. So, high school GED versus, people who have at least a graduate degree, on average, they kind of share this belief. And same for family income, which means that, these results are not driven by, there's some kind of demographic feature that's predicting this, that's explaining the slope, but rather it's this like more distributed ideology that people have, that is not totally based on their education or income level. Okay, so just to wrap up this third study, and how does AI disclosure change the inferences people make about author intelligence? So again, grain of salt, but when people learn about AI usage from authors, assumptions and beliefs about author intelligence do go down, but they seem to be moderated by their language ideologies. And importantly, AI models seem to make this connection between, big words and, intelligence and long sentences in their output. So basically, it seems that we live in this world where, people have this belief in language and intelligence, and AI models are like, they're they have this predilection to kind of generate that text or also make that association. Okay, so I know this was a lot. I hope this was instructive and interesting for you all, and I really look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, AJ. Really appreciate you coming to talk to us. If anyone has any questions, please either leave them in the chat or feel free to unmute and ask.
I'll ask a question if no one has one. Thank you. This was super interesting and really well presented, very clear. So maybe you answered this, but in your first study, you showed us how when you looked at these linguistic features, or I forget what the actual measure was, the T5, I don't know if there were linguistic features or characteristics of the writing, whatever the term is, you were able to show that the LLM generated essays and human essays were quite distinct. So I guess my question is, do human readers also see that?
So we have not studied that. We have not studied that. I can say, Clint, did Austin give a presentation with PRIISM?
Last year he did, yeah.
He presented the admissions stuff, right?
He did, yes.
So on that project, because I'm also on that project with Austin Van Loon, MIT Sloan. So we asked people like, okay, here's an essay, or here are two essays, or I'd have to go back, but like, how likely do you think this was co-written or written by AI, co-written with or written by? And for like a random sample of online survey participants, it was like somewhere between 50 to 60%, somewhere in there. And that's like out of like 50% is the baseline. So then we also had admissions officers who, like, as part of their jobs, they read admissions essays. So you would think like, maybe they could do like better, but they're also like hovering right around 60%, which like, like that, okay, like that's better than a coin flip, but also not that much better. So, right. My feeling is that people potentially overestimate their ability to detect AI generated text. Although like, my studies and that study, that's not exactly what we set out to do, but that's my hunch.
Interesting. So then what's the justification for choosing to analyze the essays using these particular measures that are not visible to the human brain or eye?
I will say, like, it's partly like based on like my past research. So in my past research, it was more this like production side of things. Like, if you were to treat an admissions essay like any other piece of text and, do this like kind of like cultural demography of like what people write about and how they write, like these are the, like, those papers that I mentioned at the beginning, like these are the types of patterns you see. So we were kind of like, this was kind of like extending that work. It's like, what is this kind of like linguistic, social, cultural landscape look like once you introduce LLMs to the fields, to the equation? So it's like, like for me, it's like, I used to be a high school English teacher. So I also think about it a lot in those terms of like, like, yes, like part of me wants wants students to like write things that are going to help them get into college, like totally. But at the same time, like I really worry about the potential of AI and LLMs to like totally flatten their stories, their identities, their backgrounds. So like that's also kind of the perspective that I'm coming at it from. But like a reception side, like totally, like, no, I would love to do that at some point. It's definitely on the to-do list.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'll ask a question. Actually, I have two questions. They're not terribly important, but one is kind of a speculation. Will the AI industry be processing your results so that 5 years from now they're gone? That's a speculation question. And then the other is with reference to your background as an English teacher. I'm retired, but I taught statistics for 40 years and when I've tried to help people write clear result sections or introductions, they were always using passive voice and these long sentences because they wanted it to look intelligent or opaque or something.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious if my getting them to get rid of passive and have shorter declarative sentences, if it would have made it seem less sophisticated to AI. But the first question is really my main question. You know, are your results being studied by the AI industry, and will that have an impact on the algorithms in the future?
So potentially. So the one thing is like that I didn't mention is that the human written essays that we're using to compare, those were totally walled off. At no point did they even like leave their server that they sit on. So like it's possible that, like I don't know, maybe there's someone, an open AI or Anthropic, who decides to like take on college admissions as their like, I don't know, like a calling or whatever, and they want to work on it. I mean, presumably they'd be able to see like at least like the prompting that we did and the text that they generated, but in our analyses, they wouldn't be able to see the actual human written text. They wouldn't even be able, I mean, they wouldn't even be able to see the final essays that applicants admitted or submitted unless they, unless the student submitted like a purely AI generated essay and they just have it on hand. So there's kind of like, like we were careful about that for like security and, privacy reasons. But, what these AI companies do, these kinds of like design choices, it's just like, we have no idea. We have no idea. It's all proprietary, and they have the right to like kind of keep things secret. I will say my feeling is like, like even though these tools are used a lot in educational contexts, at the end of the day, like they're more geared for like corporate settings. Like this is like enterprise software. It's enterprise software that happens to be useful for us and for like, any our students. And, to me, what that means is like if there would be a change in these kinds of patterns as you're talking about, they would also, in my guess, I would predict that would also implicate a change in just US corporate culture in some way. I don't know what to do with that, but I think like I don't know if like this is like on their radar as much. The other thing I'll say is like, for the short, the declarative sentences. So I mean, AI is used a lot to evaluate text. I mean, there's like conferences that are using AI to review. There's reviewers who are using AI to review, even though maybe they shouldn't. And there's also like lots of times where an AI will read through a cover letter. If it's the case that one of the criteria that these like different evaluators are looking for is like, is this person intelligent based on this text that they provided? Then yeah, that could be a big problem if they're writing like more declarative, punchier, more confident kinds of like sentences. Potentially, we haven't done any like AI evaluation in that third experiment, but yeah, it could be a problem.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have so many questions. I don't know where to start, but so I mean, in theory, someone could, like, I know there are generative AI tools that will allow you to guide them more than just how you do your prompt, right? Mm-hmm. So like in theory, you could upload your favorite writing guide, right? Like mine is Williams and Bishop, which wants the active voice and short declarative sentences and all that. And you could guide, things around that. But then I don't know. So more human in the loop, I suppose, could help with that. Although I'm generally a skeptic of lots of these tools. I have a kind of a more of a meta question though, which is that what are you seeing universities doing, right? Like in response to all this, is there any organization that's doing something that you're like, wow, that is so cool. That's a great response to this, or is everyone just so flummoxed and 3 years behind that there's no great case studies to point to?
In the admissions world, it's flummoxed, but also a total free for all. So, every university is just throwing spaghetti at the wall, seeing what sticks. So, University of Michigan, for example, one of their essay prompts is, have an AI write an essay, submit that essay, and then submit another essay where you critique that essay or something. Caltech, Georgia Tech, I think more like the technical schools, they have an AI disclosure piece, how exactly did you use AI? Are students responding to that? Who knows, right? So basically, I can tell you from being in different conversations that everyone knows it's a free for all, and there's this kind of desire to have some kind of policy intervention. I don't know what that would mean. I don't know what it would look like, but just to give you one example, I was at this was almost 2 years ago at this point. I was at a college board event, and it was all admissions officers and directors of admission, whatever, vice VP of enrollment. So many of them would say we need policy suggestions that aren't just oh, let's just ask that, let's have them write an essay with AI and see if they like it, or whatever. So I think it's a free for all, but they don't want it to be. And yeah, I don't know. It's I bet NYU, most applied to university in the country, I bet they're not having a great time trying to figure all this stuff out.
Thank you. That's helpful and depressing, but not surprising.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question if someone wants to chime in.
If no one's going to ask anything.
Go for it, Jennifer.
This is maybe a little off topic, but I used to teach a writing class. So I'm a statistician, but used to teach a writing class. It's now taught by someone else, but one day I might teach it again. How would you, if you were teaching a writing class, how would you incorporate AI?
Ooh.
Sorry, that's mean. That's a mean question.
No, yeah. I think I mentioned in the beginning, I kind of come at this stuff with this sociolinguistic-y language and identity, culture and identity perspective. So, for me, that would be the first kind of thing. So for example, I would start thinking about if I have a student who grew up in a country or a household that doesn't speak English as a first language, how can I explain these things and the AI generated suggestions? How can I explain them in such a way that is reasonable and interpretable, but also doesn't squash their experiences, their background, their identity? I will say I used to be more I don't know, I used to be more down on AI, and in some ways I still am, but I also just feel it's one of those things where it's like, well, if everyone's doing it, who am I to tell my students to not use it? So I kind of, I don't know. But then on the other side, it's like, for us as experts, we had our whole, kindergarten through PhD education, like, for us like, like not current grad students, all of that, we had to learn how to do it. So on the other side, like what I really worry about is like over reliance, and then this like the, the kind of like deprecation of expertise, because it's
And what's happening to your brain when you're not using it? I mean, like, right, there's the MIT study where you see like that nothing's happening when you're right. Like that can't be good for people.
Right. I mean, and then, also just like the stigma, with this experiment, it's like, for us in academia, like, the importance of sounding smart cannot be understated, right? And, the way that we sound smart is usually through our writing, not exclusively, but for the most part. And if it turns out that like, all this AI disclosure stuff, which is like, that's like kind of like the norm for journals, like, oh, did you use AI or not? If like, if there's like a penalty, even though if it's not like a major penalty, and it's not like changing anyone's like minds, hearts or minds in terms of what they already believe, but if there is a penalty and you're submitting to like a very competitive journal, like why disclose at all? So it's also like there's also this dynamic of like, how can we use this tool, if we're going to use it, in such a way that we don't kind of like erode our own minds, erode our own skills, erode our professional kind of like expertise or whatever. But also, how do we do it in such a way that people aren't going to think we're dummies? Like, it's not easy. It's like, it's a really tough needle to thread right now. And I personally don't know of any precedents. Maybe like television. I don't know.
Yeah, in early days they were saying the calculator, right?
Yeah.
But I think we've gone beyond that.
Yeah.
I have to jump to another meeting, but thank you so much. This was
you.
fascinating. Really appreciate you joining us.
Appreciate it. Thank you.